to welcome you all nevertheless, and to say that we look forward to having a lively discussion over the next hour or so about the topic for today: has COVID made the case for big government? I'm Alexander Downer. I'm the Executive Chair of the International School for Government. And our two guests today, I will introduce now, are Jonathan Slater. Jonathan, until very recently, was the Permanent Under-Secretary at the Department of Education, is a visiting professor at the Policy Institute at King's College London, and he has had a long and very distinguished career over several decades in the UK civil service. Our other guest today is Professor Richard Sullivan, who will be known to many of you, the director of the Institute of Cancer Policy and the co-director of the Conflict and Health Research Group at King's College London. He too has a very distinguished career. What I'm going to do is ask each of our two guests if they will make some introductory remarks of around 10 minutes each. Then I will myself put 2 or 3 questions to them on this interesting topic of whether COVID has made the case for big government. And then we'll set aside some time for those of you who are on the call to ask questions as well. And that will be handled by Professor Andrew Massey, who is the academic director at the International School for Government at King's College London. So let's start, I think, with Jonathan Slater. And Jonathan, so if you'd be kind enough to lead off here on this fascinating topic. I think by way of introduction, I should also add one thing, which is that I myself was a member of a government for many years, of the Australian government, though not the British government. But I was a member of a government through a period when small government, reducing taxes, balancing budgets, privatisation, that was very, very much the zeitgeist of government in Western countries at that time. So no doubt Jonathan has been a civil servant in the UK civil service during much of that same period. So it'll be very interesting to hear what you have to say, Jonathan, as we are either addressing a particular issue in a particular way, or we're seeing a sea change in how the whole issue of government is handled. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alexander. It's great to be here. Great to have the chance to take part in what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion. I don't know if there are any anarchists on the call. If there are, then I've got some bad news to start with, but don't give up. I've got some more positive news for you at the end. So the bad news is, I think for most of the people, most of the time, when something badly goes wrong, when there is a crisis one sort or another, either nationally or internationally, most people expect the government to sort it out, to get stuck in. They do. Whether that is during the financial crisis in 2008, when the government ends up owning several banks of a sort that it hadn't done previously, or whether it is during the current coronavirus crisis, where the government finds itself determining by legislation the circumstances in which people are allowed to hug each other. In such circumstances, when there is a crisis, the public expects government to sort it out, to do the very best they can to keep them safe, to protect their money, to protect their lives. Now, in a democracy, the public then expects those powers to be relinquished once the crisis is over. The powers are there, government gets big for the purpose of tackling the crisis. And as I say, in a democracy, it needs to come to an end when the crisis is over. And to be fair, that normally happens in a democracy. George Osborne was very keen to sell his bank shares as soon as he could. And indeed, the rules on who you're allowed to hug in what circumstances have got more liberal, albeit 11 days too late, for a particular high-profile case in the last month or so. So I don't think there is anything inevitable about powers that government takes on to tackle a crisis remaining in place forever. There is obviously something in a democracy that you need to guard against, the possibility that a government of any persuasion will sort of enjoy the power at its disposal, which it was given for a particular purpose and will keep hold of it. You need to guard against that. But in general, I would say our experience is that things go back to normal. If anything, I would say, in my experience, the public expects rather more action by governments to keep them and their money safe than governments feel comfortable taking. That's the sort of, I mean, that's been my experience in the UK. I don't know whether others agree. So when I was the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Education, our view in the first, right at the beginning of the pandemic, was that schools should remain open. There wasn't a particularly high risk, and children's education was at stake. But schools just started closing anyway, because parents stopped sending their children to school. The public essentially was ahead of government action. And that's been repeated over and over again, as we all know. When the rate of coronavirus was such that it was possible for some children to start going back to school after the May half term, the government had a debate and decided that schools would be open to large numbers of children. Many of them didn't come. The public's view about protecting its own safety was something that government had underestimated again. As I say, in my experience in education, and not just in education, obviously the Prime Minister has been under a certain amount of pressure himself from whether he was taking tough enough action early enough. The public, interestingly, expects government to take more action often than it does. I'm not making a point just about the current circumstances. I'm saying that's typically what happens in my experience in this country in a crisis. So I don't think you can draw broad lessons about big, small government from a particular crisis, although it would be interesting to see whether others agree. I've thought about the question in the way that Alexander's invited me to, by sort of reference to my last 20 years, what's happened over time, whether there's a crisis or not. And as Alexander says, it's certainly true that government has got smaller in some significant degree. Some things it used to do when I was a kid, it no longer does, absolutely. Privatisation, as Alexander says, is a big example of that. But there are also, if I look back on my childhood, all sorts of things the government now does do that it never used to do. So when I was a child at school, it was my teacher who decided what I should learn in the classroom. But now it's the government. I'm not expressing views whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a simple matter of fact that we now have a national curriculum. The minister determines what's in it. My daughter at school knows a lot about fronted adverbials because the government decided that she should do so. So government has got a lot bigger, actually, in respect of the world of education. The current Secretary of State made a speech yesterday in which he set out what his view was about the use of mobile phones in classrooms. Now, when I was at school, obviously there were no such thing as mobile phones, but the Secretary of State for Education was not a powerful figure who would determine what would go on in the classroom. The Department for Education, when I was a child, issued guidance which schools could follow or not as they wished. So that'd be one example where government has got a lot bigger over the last couple of generations. I used to work in the Ministry of Justice, and my responsibility working for Ken Clarke was to design ways of trying to improve the efficiency of the court service and the probation service. When I was a child, such a job did not exist. Central government did not run courts, did not run the probation service. These were not government functions at all. Before that, I worked in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, supporting Tony Blair on how to reduce waiting times, working with managers across the health service who did not exist when I was a kid. The idea of managers running the NHS, reporting into government, would have seen as a very foreign thing when I was a child. Again, I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. What I'm saying is it's become something that government does these days. So it's got smaller in some ways, it's got bigger in other ways. I don't know. It's a complicated subject, and I haven't got the time to explore it in detail here, as to whether you could sort of bring a common thread through that. But I suppose one thing I would say is that there's been a reduction of trust over my adult years. Politicians of all political parties, I'm definitely not making political point here, it's just as much trying to Labour and Liberal Democrats. Politicians don't trust teachers, essentially, to do what's best for the children in general. They want to set a curriculum for them because they're not confident that teachers will do what's right for the children. You wouldn't want to leave doctors really running hospitals. They might not do what's in the interest of the patients, the notion of provider capture. You wouldn't want local government to be too powerful if you're a central government politician. Again, I'm talking about in the UK, things have got more and more centralised over time. There's been a sort of reduction of trust. You might even say central government politicians trust themselves less. They don't trust themselves to run some of the services they used to. They think it would be better for the private sector to do that themselves, and so they privatise them. Again, I'm not offering a view as to whether this is good or bad, and it depends on the circumstances. I'm just trying to make a sort of general point. Of course, it works both ways. Actually, unfortunately, the public trusts government a lot less than when I was a kid. The levels of trust in governments, again, of all political persuasions, have gone down and down and down over time. And so just to come back finally to where I started, whether a government is big or small depends upon the circumstances of the time, and should depend in a democracy on whether the public consents to the size of the government at the time. And generally it does. But I'm a little bit nervous that as trust in politics and governments reduces and the disconnect between the public and the politicians increases over time, as I say, over 20 years, I'm a little bit nervous for what that means for the deal as to the size of the government. There we are. I told you I have something for the anarchists. Back to you, Alexander.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much. There's certainly some fascinating points you've made there. I've seen a little bit of work in recent times on this question of trust, and not just trust in governments and trust in politicians, but the broader question of trust in society, whether you trust other people in other occupations, and you refer to teachers, even doctors, local government, lack of trust in those people, or at least a diminution of trust in those people. It's a very interesting way to look at it. And I think more broadly, you raise a question about maybe the political class, governments, are under pressure from the public here for more intervention in a range of different social areas, and perhaps less intervention in the sort of mechanics of economics, or running a train service, or although it seems to be coming back into more public ownership now, but bus services and train services and utilities and so on, more run by the private sector for utilitarian reasons. But the people, the government perhaps, but the public looking for more interventions on social questions. Well, thank you, Jonathan, as I said, very much for that. And Richard, we'll hand over to you.
Alexander, thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to pick up from where Jonathan left off there. You won't be surprised. I'm going to tackle this really from more broadly a health perspective. And I'm going to maybe illuminate the sort of fundamental tensions at the heart of this, and be slightly combative as well, if I may, Alexander. I think firstly to say that overall, I think the infrequency and specificity of pandemics means that the lessons from history have to be approached with enormous caution. Alex Duval's mantra, know your epidemic and act on its politics, emphasizes the importance of context specificity, both for the analysis and for the scenario building. So I guess with that in mind, it's clear that COVID-19 really has changed both the optics and the nature of big government. And here I want to be very definitionally strict. I'm here talking about excessively large and or unconstitutional intrusion into public life. But immediately that you say that, you can see this becomes a matter of perspective. You could even argue it's a matter of political hue as well. Now, the use of, I think, of emergency politics in COVID-19 has involved invoking powers most often associated, frankly, with authoritarianism. Now, it's really too early to draw, I think, any conclusive findings, but evidence suggests that COVID-19 has been strengthening the role and power of the state, both in positive and in negative ways. In many contexts, the use of emerging measures has been with widespread, but I don't think by universal, notional public consent of the people. And that's an important point to make. And that includes the lockdowns we've had, border closures, the use of surveillance, and indeed the broader use of security sector in policy enforcement. Now, whether there is consent or not, these powers are most often associated with authoritarianism, and there are widespread fears that expressed in the analysis that elites in a range of countries, not just the UK, are using these emergency measures to take advantage of the crisis to centralise and consolidate power. And it speaks to that point about Jonathan's point about how do you draw back after you've engaged and intervened in a crisis. So from a purely public health perspective, is it right to be interventionist from a public health standpoint? And clearly the answer to that is yes. Governments have always done that. Major crises, one has to intervene. This is the point in terms of the role and responsibility of government, but not at the expense of freedom to decide on individual risk or to live our lives fully. It's very easy for the new biopolitics to become biofascism in that sense. And when governments start deciding what types of death matters, I think we've entered, as maybe the Cameroonian philosopher Akili Mbembe would say, a new form of necropolitics. So you have to be extraordinarily wary about where those dividing lines are for intervention versus trusting and accepting the judgment of how the public and society wish to act. I think there's also an erroneous notion that government and its professional elites know best. And here I think the experience of the UK is very important. We've seen, of course, some of the high success deaths rates in the whole of the high income countries, both due to COVID-19 related deaths and also due to the friction shutdown of the health service in other areas, something we've published on extensively, particularly in cancer. The problem is that authoritarian behaviours only focus on COVID-19, irrespective of wider health or welfare, clearly illuminates a critical flaw of big government. The idea that there is benevolent paternalism, that big government will always get it right when a crisis comes along. But there's also a paradox, and it goes back to what Jonathan said there. The complexity of preparedness, mitigation, response clearly shows there doesn't just need to be big government, but big government writ large in a really post-Westphalian way, because this crosses national borders. This is, the crisis we're experiencing now with COVID-19 is not just a matter for the UK government. And again, as we've argued in our work on health security intelligence, many of the great failures have actually rested in this inability or unwillingness of governments to act much bigger in this sense, either to gather actionable intelligence, to work at scale, to engage in authorizations of mass border closures, etc. So there's a real contradiction at heart here when we're talking about big government and within the COVID-19 and whether things have changed or not. I think there's little doubt across the world that the pandemic has been utilized by governments to expand a range of interventionist political and security agendas. This ranges from more interventionist policies around security sector, civilian public health integration. People like Professor Martin Bricknell, who's here at King's, former Surgeon General of UK's Defence Medical Service, has written extensively about this. That is relatively benign, you could argue, as big government, but it also goes through to more insidious erosions. Again, in work we've done around signal intelligence and the rise of participatory SIG-IN, there's been a real extension of biosurveillance by governments, and it's been driven by three areas: the rise of surveillance capitalism, number one; secondly, the exploitation of public health crises to obscure states of exception politics; and finally, the historically enduring nature of emergency implemented surveillance measures. Essentially, what we're talking about is measures that are put in place but are essentially never rolled back after the crises. So in short, the biopolitical environment has been deemed fertile for even greater intervention and surveillance beyond the primary purpose. Indeed, you could argue today's mobile COVID app is tomorrow's geofencing tool. But, and here's the contradiction again, I think technologies are part of the normative order and therefore they're public goods as well. Technology, even our most clandestine capabilities, are really essential public and clinical tools. If not now, then for the future disease X. Let's be honest, if disease X comes along next time and it's a MERS-like coronavirus, that had a case fatality rate of nearly 35%, with 80% of people infected ending up in ITU, then we'd all better pray that big government has a preparedness plan and is willing to intervene in that manner. So again, we have this contradiction for what people are seeing and what people are talking about, and then the realities of what might happen further on down the stream. And finally, let me sort of conclude by saying that, I think the pandemic has triggered a wide range of direct risks to health and healthcare systems, but also indirect risks to economies, livelihoods, social relations, and political systems. I think it's exposed a lot of growing inequalities and vulnerabilities, from informal workers to healthcare workers. And I think in the social media junkie age, there is a consistent demand to intervene, and do something about social capital, social cohesion, well-being, sustainable development, inclusion, etc., etc., etc. But none of these are facets and products of big government. They're part of societal fabric and societal structures. So I think COVID-19 shone a really uncomfortable strobe light onto exactly what Jonathan was saying, questions of power, legitimacy, and trust that speak to the darker side of big government. It's extraordinarily contradictory because on the one hand, you can compare ourselves to what we've seen in Sweden, where we've seen a lot of light touch engagement with the population, arguably a better trajectory with the COVID-19 pandemic and keeping the wider healthcare system open. On the other hand, we can actually look ourselves in comparison to, say, South Korea, for example, which seemed a highly securitized, highly authoritarian approach to the pandemic, which looks like it will be implemented for the foreseeable future going forward. Again, it appears to be with the agreement of those citizens within South Korea. But to the outsider, that looks like an extraordinarily authoritarian big government approach to a biological threat, which isn't going to be unwound. So I guess my concluding comment is to say that I don't think we really have a very good view at the moment on big government, and that we haven't really foundationally discussed about the founding principles of what we would expect for big governments to do. But I think, again, it comes down to this problem of the power, legitimacy, and trust that Jonathan was speaking to, and the erosion that we've seen over the last year and a half in those domains, which I think has really made a big challenge for the way government operates when having to deal with these very complex, long-lived forms of emergency. And with that, I shall rest. Thank you very much indeed, Alexander.
Thank you, Richard, very much. That's excellent. And you're right. There'll be people who'll agree with you. I'm finding myself quite comfortable with what you're saying, and there'll be people who disagree with you. I'm sure of that. I want to start off by asking you to respond to listening to you both to this question. I mean, we have seen an accretion of power by government, a huge amount of spending, a large number of restrictions on activities, restrictions which are designed to address COVID-19, but may have a whole series of other consequences which don't appear to be so controversial at the moment. One of the things that struck me is how willing the public have been to accept all of these measures, particularly the huge restrictions on their civil liberties. What in other countries in a different era would have been called human rights abuses, actually. But people are, it's not just that governments have been willing to do it, it's that the governments, I suspect, have been willed on to do it by the public. And if the British government had, for example, continued with the so-called Swedish approach, the light touch, and people had been dying as in nursing homes all the same, there would have been a huge public outcry for more restrictions. Go hard, go early was one of the slogans that was used. So who is driving this? Is the public driving it, or do politicians? Do you seriously think the politicians enjoy this huge increase in power that they've grasped for themselves? So, Jonathan, you've been working within government, so let's go to you first.
Well, my own personal experience of this was in respect of education. I referred to this briefly already, where the government's view was that schools should stay open, But whenever any parent heard of any child at their local school getting coronavirus in March 2020, they told their kid, "You're staying with me." And so the schools closed. And so, yes, if you see things, if government tries to look at things through the lens of normal circumstances, then as you say, Alexander, it wouldn't dream of taking on the sorts of powers that it's taken on. But that's the wrong way to look at it, isn't it? That's not the way the public's looking at it anyway. The public's looking at, how am I going to stay safe? How is my child not going to die? And of course, they may, not understand, because they're not Chris Whitty, what the risks are that are being taken. But that's the question. I mean, I was really struck when I read the leaked version of Exercise Signet, the 2016 practice run that the Department of Health and the Secretary of State for Health at the time and local government and police did. I mean, I've only read the leaked report, obviously, but what it showed was that they were starting 7 weeks in to a pandemic in which thousands of people were dying a week. And the questions they were asking themselves in this exercise was, how are we going to make sure there's enough space to bury the bodies? Who's going to have their ventilators turned off? And who's going to decide who's going to have their ventilators turned off? These are the questions that government was asking themselves. What they appeared not, and civil servants and the rest of it, everybody working on this, right? That was the exercise they chose to explore. Not what will the public think about this situation that we've got ourselves in, and will they let it happen? If you ask yourself the question, will the public let us lock them inside our houses, in their houses? The answer is going to be no. But if you ask yourselves the question, what will the public do to keep themselves safe, or think they're going to keep themselves safe, you end up with children not going to school. You end up with an outrage when anybody in government seems to act differently from the expectations on them. That's the way that I would see it. The government got a bit left behind, as did the planners on this 5 years previously, because they were thinking about it through a sort of powers lens rather than through a behavioral lens. I completely agree, obviously, with Richard and the implication of your question, that the risk is that government gets used to these powers. So it definitely wasn't government's idea, no. But the government gets used to these powers and wants to carry on using them. That is always a risk. I was reading the Arms to Iraq inquiry report the other day for complicated reasons, doing some research I'm doing at King's, and the powers that ministers used to sell, to authorize the selling of machine tools to Saddam Hussein were powers that they were given in 1939, emergency powers for the purposes of the Second World War, that everybody thought had been removed in 1945, but it turned out they hadn't. So there's definitely a risk, and of course there is. And my final thought on this is that to manage down that risk, and I think it relates to arms to Iraq, is a good example of it. Parliament needs to be much more effective at holding ministers to account. They didn't have the chance even to debate these extraordinarily restrictive powers on who you could hug and where you could go. And maybe that's okay in an emergency, but Parliament needs to be much more able and effective at holding ministers to account on behalf of the public, because the public only gets a chance at this once every 5 years.
Yes, although there seems to have been a bit of a consensus across the Parliament. I mean, the criticism of the government, other than from its own backbenchers, it's more libertarian backbenchers, but most of the criticism of the government in the Parliament is criticism that they haven't gone in hard enough and there aren't enough restrictions. They haven't closed borders enough.
I'm talking more about what happens afterwards, when the crisis is over, and making sure those powers aren't retained. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay, Richard.
I think it's difficult to unpick this without looking at this in the context of what the political landscape was when COVID happened and hit the country, and then the changes we've seen over time. So the first thing to say is that, again, it comes back to this problem of the legitimacy and trust and not getting ahead of the curve. We had an issue here right at the beginning where government and our operational, let's be honest, there was no readiness here. Despite this being a category tier 1 on the National Risk Register, our preparedness was absolutely woeful. But the operational reaction when the cases really started going through the roof was really quite woeful. And I think the problem here is it's difficult to disentangle what the government and how the government reacted from what people were seeing on the ground. Because people, remember, we saw the death rate suddenly climbing exponentially. And so people in the general public knew an awful lot of individuals who were either very sick in hospital or who died in the first wave. And so in that sense, I think, the compliance with the hard lockdown, and it was a very, very hard lockdown during the first wave. I mean, this was really stay-at-home orders. For those of us working in London, it was like some sort of dystopian movie walking through London. It was empty. But it was, there was a complete involvement and agreement on behalf of the public that this had to happen. There was no doubt at all, because everybody suddenly realized how serious the problem was and how acute it was. I think the issue for me, really, when you're looking at it, there is we let the COVID myopia overtake the way that policy making was ongoing here, and it comes down to this problem that there was really, as you say in Parliament, no challenge to this. In fact, I'd actually argue that when you look at the Labour Party, and I'm going to be part of political here, they were even more extreme on the sorts of lockdowns and restriction movements than we were seeing on what you consider to be the right of the political spectrum. And indeed, the public day in, day out were being fed horror stories across all aspects of media. So there's a problem here that even as a politician, the narrative and the sentiment was running away because it was being driven so hard by essentially the fear mongering here. And of course, there was advantages to be taken in that because, of course, from a behavioral perspective, getting people to do things, fear is a very, very powerful way of getting people to do things very quickly. But as many people recognize very early on, there's a limit to how much fear will change public sentiment and get people to do what you want them to do. And then what we saw later on with the crisis as it was evolving is, of course, the unraveling of legitimacy and trust because of all sorts of events that were occurring, essentially left the public behind. But I think this is a really, really tough one, because I think until we get to the end, and I think the end is not until 2022, unpicking the temporal changes over time in terms of the legitimacy and trust aspects for the general public going to be very difficult. But you cannot take the media out of this and the opposition as well, because they've been very, very powerful influences in the way that government has or has not behaved here.
Yes, I think that the way I would restructure that slightly is to say that public opinion has driven the government as much as the government has driven public opinion, though it leads me to question, and I'll be interested in what you both think of this before we go over to deal with questions in our Q&A box. The extent to which the government and the scientists who the government has used, who are more single focused on, the exam question for them has been, how do you reduce the incidence, if not eliminate COVID-19? And the answer is, well, you might not be able to do it, but if you can reduce it, because it's a transmissible disease, by stopping people meeting each other, full stop. But then there is no debate about what the consequences of that are over and above reducing the incidence of COVID. So, I do think that is one huge issue here. So if government takes much more power into its hands in response to messages that from government are being transmitted through the media, there may be a series of unintended consequences that flow from that. And the cure may turn out to be very damaging. So it's a very hard judgment for governments to make. So, Jonathan.
Yes, well, I agree. This is difficult stuff. I mean, I think we're all agreeing that interestingly, in this case, the public was driving, or the majority public view was driving. Certainly in the first period, and as Richard says, fear is a powerful driver. Absolutely. If you're trying to sort of draw more general conclusions from this set of circumstances, another obvious thing that always happens is that people prioritize today over tomorrow. People don't save as much money as they should do for their old age, and you need the government to incentivize people to take those sorts of decisions, to think for the long term. That's why you have pension schemes or national insurance, because if you just leave it to people, they'll worry only about today more than tomorrow in general. And so that applies in this case here, doesn't it? We're all anxious about whether we're going to get coronavirus today. It's very hard for us as individuals to think about the consequences of a set of policies which might reduce the chance of us getting coronavirus, but might increase the chance of us getting cancer. It's very hard for the public to make that sort of trade-off. And that is one of the purposes of collective decision-making through government. And it is one of the things that government has to do to balance short-term and long-term, and try and have an honest conversation with the public about that. It's incredibly hard, the pressures that government is under from the media, from the opposition. Absolutely, that is always the case. It's really hard to do that. And quite often governments find it too hard, and they create some independent commission to answer the question about how much money people should be saving for their old age, or something like that. But I agree with you, Alexander, that one of the purposes of government is to balance the short-term interest along the long-term interest. But they can only do that, they can only persuade the public to act to behave differently if the public trusts them. And that's my nervousness about the relationship between how the public thinks about politicians and politicians themselves. It just makes the task of government so much harder.
My guess, though, is that their trust ebbs and flows. It depends, is the answer to the question on trust. So when it's come to imposing a series of draconian measures in response to COVID, the public trust of the government has been quite high, actually.
Well, I'm just thinking, Alexander, I'm just looking at opinion polls tracking
generally
what the public
declining.
think, and over 40 years. And sure, people are a bit less confident about doctors and teachers than they used to be, but it's basically 90%, right? Of people will generally trust doctors and teachers to tell the truth. That doesn't mean they're right. I'm just saying that's the level of trust. About 50% of the public will trust their neighbour to tell the truth, right? And about 10% of the public will trust a minister to tell the truth. That's the current position. I don't mean literally today. I'm just talking about if you look at an opinion poll a year ago, pre-COVID, right? It may be changing now. It may be that people trust the government more than they used to. Would you bet that trust levels in the government have gone up in the last 6 months?
I think temporarily it may have done for a while. Yes, there would be reasons for that. We can go into another time, but I think the success of the vaccine rollout would have made people think, well, they're not all bad. They seem to be able to get something right. They'll think that. I'm not saying whether that's a fair point of view. It does seem to me to be fair, but whether that's fair or not is another question. Richard, what do you think? You by the way, sometimes talk about unintended consequences as well of these all these draconian measures. So
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe we shouldn't be trusting as much as we are.
Yeah, I think firstly on that aspect is that, you're absolutely right. There is the single-mindedness around the COVID and the trade-off of what it meant as we shut down healthcare systems and as welfare decreased and the long-term impact wasn't considered. And despite the fact there was a lot of work coming out very early on showing that the policies were either shutting down parts of the healthcare system or putting friction up to such a high degree, it was to all intents and purposes shutting it down. And, particularly obviously in cancer, delays in diagnosis or delays in treatment have enormous consequences downstream for stage shifts and then excess mortality. But there was this absolute, total focus on COVID-19. And in a sense, it took a long time to get out to the general public that there were these trade-offs to be had, that this wasn't just simply a matter of controlling the pandemic, that in terms of to control one thing, something else had to give, and there had to be a happy medium here. And the problem, I think, generally is a lot of the decisions being made in this kind of massive, I think we termed it an infodemic, the amount of data that was pouring out and the way that people were taking that information, and I don't talk disinformation because that's hostile, China, Russia, etc. I'm talking about misinformation. The way that data was then presented at all sorts of different levels in ways which I think if you're a member of the general public, even if you are the most highly educated clinical epidemiologist, virologist, people were struggling with trying to understand what the data meant for them as individuals, despite much of this data actually being population data or modeling, for example. The number of people that still think modeling is forecasting, which of course it's not. But there was this problem, I think, is what ran away from government as well, was the ability to explain to the public in clear, authoritative terms what this actually meant for individuals. And therein lies the comparison with other countries, and I'm going to use Sweden again, where they were very overt about the risks, about what it would mean. If you behaved like X, then the consequences were the following things would happen. People would die in these situations, etc. So you had better behave in this manner, in an appropriate manner, in order to slow the passage of the virus. In other words, that's a distributed, what I would call small government, trusting people to do the right thing approach. But I'll be honest with you, I think we lost complete control of the infosphere around COVID-19, and it just became this melange. I think by the end of the first lockdown, I mean, it was absolutely crazy, the amount of information coming out from different sources, different levels. And then on top of that, of course, we had numerous members of SAGE, SPI-B, SPI-M going unilateral in terms of declarations of their views on what the data meant. And often many of these declarations and statements were completely contradictory to each other. And I genuinely mean it. Even as a sort of an expert in the centre, I was getting confused on a weekly basis. And how on earth anybody else was supposed to make sense of this? Now, so in other words, what you had then is a kind of strange situation where the political elites at the top were being washed around by this infodemic, and people at the bottom were experiencing the same thing as well. So I think it's been extremely challenging actually to dissect out the wheat from the chaff on this.
I just going to start going over to the questions, and Andrew, and as in Andrew Massey, I'll hand over to you. But let me just start off the questions, listening to you both. With the first one, it's from an anonymous attendee. And she or he says Vietnam and South Korea, for the most part, have handled their pandemic response extraordinarily well. Don't you think a stricter, more big government approach works best in these exceptional emergency scenarios for saving lives? Well, Richard, you've alluded to the Swedish model, which is the reverse, I suppose. That's been the small government response. I'm not sure in terms of the financial measures that they've taken in Sweden, whether they have been small, maybe not. But that has very much been the hands-off approach, just giving people a bit of advice compared to Vietnam and South Korea. So why don't you both begin by answering that question? And Andrew, then I'll hand over to you the rest of the questions.
Health warning. I'm not a health expert, so Richard may have a better answer to this than me. From my perspective, what I've understood to be the case is that those countries who'd been more adversely affected by SARS had a better plan for dealing with the pandemic than those that hadn't. You can bet your bottom dollar that the UK will have a better plan for dealing with the next pandemic than the current one, because such a lot of people have died. And as I understand it, those countries who saw what happened with SARS much more upfront and personal, much more than we did, unsurprisingly, put a lot of effort into making sure that when the next one happened, they were ready. I inherited a pandemic plan in the Department of Education, whose first task was keep the schools open. So that wasn't much help. I've already referred to the planning exercise done in 2016. Likewise.
Richard.
Yeah, I think that's, first of all, that's spot on. I'm always a little suspicious of the comparative comparison we often have with countries which are so different. So first of all, the preparation in places like particularly South Korea was exceptional. They had fully integrated intelligence operations already ready to go. They also had, from a social contract perspective, a very different culture. These are societies that have a fully integrated social contract with their political elites, which prizes uniformity and conformity. So it's a little bit, you're trying to compare apples with oranges here. And the same can be said for Vietnam as well, which moved very quickly and also received substantial assistance from the People's Republic of China as well. So they were able to move very quickly. There's some bit of suspicion about the data that comes out of Vietnam, but certainly South Korea has shown that. But I think from a purely practical intelligence operations perspective, it's a very interesting model and well worth learning from. The ability to replicate that at scale in British society, I would doubt you could do, because it speaks then to very different ethno-linguistic and cultural and behavioural aspects of the world. So that's where I kind of stand on that question.
Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Alexander.
We must be on.
Sorry. I think just to carry on from the point Richard's just made, I mean, the context is everything. When we understand these things, and of course, South Korea only became a functioning democracy as late as 1979, 1980, and many of the structures and social mores and ways of behaviour that they had in all those years of not being a democracy are still there. So there was a different view of what government should and shouldn't do. And so I think it's important always to remember the cultural context as well as the political and historical context. If I may, I'd like to take some of the points together, some of the anonymous questions, as well as those from Majid and the others, Mary, who've put their names down, so that we can cover everything in the time that's left. And some of them have overlapping points. So I think the main ones that come out on one side are, can the average Joe really be trusted to do the right thing? So there's a sort of pro-government, big government view from some of those perspectives. Can big government ever win against big business and particular big tech? So there's on one side there's a belief that as Majid says, that famous Ronald Reagan quote, "The problem of government is government," and that we should, and essentially both answer this in slightly different ways. Should we be saying, is big government, can it be trusted to do the right thing, or can the public be trusted to do the right thing? And the government has overstretched on power to control the virus, but understretched on power to control the virus, but overstretched on protecting their own. And the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer. So many of these arguments we're finding in the press and the media, and it's hard to find a middle path. I'm guessing from when you're in the center and you're trying to make these decisions, often on a day-by-day basis. So taking those questions collectively with those two particular sides, more big government in order to raise people up, and less big government and more trusting in the private sector. And I wouldn't say a conflict, but a contrast in a way we can approach these things. Jonathan.
So when I was the head of the Department for Education, I made it a rule that I would always spend time with new starters to the department in their induction meeting. I would introduce myself to them and I would say a few words. And I would always say that they should remember that the Department for Education is an overhead. That if the government, if it didn't exist, I invited people to do a bit of a thought experiment. Let's say it didn't exist. What would happen tomorrow? Goodness me, children could still go to school, teacher could still teach them. £500 million of taxpayers' money would be saved. Half a dozen ministers would be without a job. Would the world be worse or would it be better? And obviously, I was a public servant, so I thought that the world could be better with the Department for Education and with government. But this was just one version of a bigger point, which is that government and those of us working for it are there on behalf of the people to enable them to achieve more together than they could achieve without us. That's why my introductory comments are all about democracy and about the connection between government and the public. And if those things work together, if the public sees the government working on their behalf to help them achieve more than they can on their own, or to help society achieve more collectively, given the levels of inequality that some of your questioners have raised, then you're in a happy place. If you've got a government which is not helping, then you're in an unhappy place. And if the government is using powers that it doesn't really have the legitimacy to use, then you're in an unhappy place. And that's what you've got to get right. So there is certainly a risk that government, having taken on powers, will keep them. I've already referred to what happened after the Second World War. I've already referred to the fact that in the UK, decision-making has been centralised increasingly, government by government, whatever political party. It's not that surprising. Governments, once they've got power, rather like using it. Why wouldn't they? What's the point of being a minister if you haven't got any power? And to be fair, Alexander's made this point too, the public does rather often expect ministers to do something, whether actually that's the most useful thing for the minister to do, rather than just get out of the way. So there is definitely a risk, and you can see it in the way that decision-making has been centralised. I gave the example of what goes on in a classroom as one example, but you could think of many, many others. The crucial thing is to keep in alignment the public and their government. And as I say, from my own view, in a parliamentary democracy like our one, that means a much more significant role for Parliament.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce a new phrase here. How about the medium-sized government? The issue comes, and I'm coming this from the social determinants of health here. The pandemic has either illuminated or cracked what was already a broken edifice in many places. We've seen inequalities growing across high-income countries, including the UK, over the last decade. Michael Marmot, keeps on talking about this very eloquently. And we saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic, is those who were hit most were people who were overweight and obese, comorbidities like hypertension and diabetes. And this is all, a lot of this is related to affluence. If you're living in a deprived neighborhood, unfortunately, these are the comorbidities you see. So it really reflected a real failure in public health across the UK. I mean, we've done nothing, frankly, since the Wainless report. It also sort of reflected deficits in the way we handle welfare as well, and particularly sort of the informal labour market, women, etc. And it sort of set a pattern in train now where people are constantly saying, well, we must intervene, we must have more big government in this. On the other hand, I mean, as Jonathan's already said, the intervention at that scale often does not work, because you're then dealing with things which are relatively distributed meso and micro level problems through macro level strategies, and it's no wonder that they either don't work or you get epiphenomena or unintended consequences. So I think in the post-COVID period, you are kind of trying to understand what this medium government looks like for the UK, something that can approach the inequalities problem by focusing on social capital, by building up welfare, but in a way that's empowering for people rather than empowering for government. Because I think it comes back to this problem of trust at the end of the day. I think there's been too much. I saw something recently which I kind of nearly fell off my chair, which was this, what was it called? The Cooper and Aitchison's new features of new authoritarianism, crony capitalism, democratic erosion, and ethnic nationalism and toxic masculinity. And somehow the UK has ended up in all three boxes, according to their political analysis. Now that's quite a big problem, actually. If people don't have trust because they see government as being big government for big business, for example, or big government for state-supported financialization, you're not going to be able to deliver the policies that are going to be needed to balance out individual autonomy and also what we believe in the UK is a generally fair and equitable society. So I guess that's my point I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm going to bring some more of those questions together and then finish with Colin's and Ian's questions. In a sense, probably a quick answers to the first two that I'm bringing together, because they're asking you to look at a crystal ball, and they don't really work any more than modelling does. So will the change in the political leadership in the health department with Sajid joining, will that make a big difference? There's a little barb in that question, given that he's an investment banker after all, says the questioner. And then the other one is, what impact do you think all these measures and restrictions will have on the private sector, and in particular on the low-skilled income in the hospitality industry and so forth? So maybe a quick question on that, because we don't know the answer, and we won't know those for decades probably, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And then we'll come back to Colin and Ian's questions, if I may. So Jonathan first.
Yeah, as you say, who knows? So Sajid Javid has, of course, inherited a plan from Matt Hancock beyond the pandemic to do a major restructuring of the NHS and take much more central control of it, reversing the reforms that Andrew Lansley implemented after 2010 election. Which demonstrates that individual secretaries of state make a big difference. The Lansley reforms were about to be undone essentially by Hancock. What Sajid Javid decides to do on that, it'll be very interesting to see. I have no idea at all. I'm simply making the point that it doesn't matter who is in charge.
Richard.
I guess something does need to change, because if you at the back, hiding at the back here in the shadows, was the OECD 2020 health report, which showed that even in the best of times, the UK's health system burns hot all the time now in terms of bed occupancy, human capacity and capability. So something radical does need to be done in the post-COVID period. What exactly that is, and I mean, I have my own personal views on what was put forward by Hancock, and it'll be interesting to see what Sajid Javid actually does. But again, it speaks to this problem of there needs to be this halfway house. There does need to be a kind of medium-sized government approach to the healthcare sector. Our problem in health is we've oscillated between extreme decentralization, extreme centralization, backwards and forwards over my professional life. And neither of those, frankly, really work. Because this is a complex adaptive system, and when you intervene in a complex adaptive system, lots of unintended consequences happen, and I don't understand why the political elites haven't worked this out yet. But I hope with a new health secretary, and also the fact we're going to have a new NHS lead very soon, that there's a real opportunity now just not to rethink just the whole of the healthcare in planning, but also then the major sub plans like national cancer control plans, which are so necessary, and frankly, which actually the AAPGs for health have made a big deal about over the last few months as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And given your comments, I'll ask you to come back immediately and respond to the final set of questions bringing together. Colin says, it's quite possible for governments to be big and small, which your point about medium. For Sweden, it's already big on social protection, while South Korea was big on regulation and information. And the other issue, of course, which you've touched on, which I'd like you to come back to this in a minute, is that the UK crisis has illuminated how we now, with devolution, have 4 governments. And in fact, things are quite disaggregated in a way. It's no longer really, although we have a central government, it's no longer quite such a centralized unitary system as you say we've been used to, even half a generation ago. And that fits in with Ian's question. No plan will ever be perfect, but it appears that many sectors of society were either not aware or weren't consulted. And in a sense, some of the people in the other nations argue that point as well. And do we need to get a better plan in place? Can we get a better plan in place, or will we just as quickly forget what we've done? So there's some meaty questions there, which is good to end with, given the very strong presentations that we started with. So, Richard, that really follows on from what you were talking about just now. So if you could go first, and then we give Jonathan the last word.
frankly, I think it's been utterly bizarre watching how the devolved nations have operated during the pandemic. And I think my heart goes out to the chief medical officers who've had to really manage what's been often, I think, unmanageable. And despite the fact that I think there's a lot of analysis to be done on this, I think it speaks to the fact that with a pandemic such as this, you need a single integrated operational plan, and you need to speak as one. I mean, there have been some ridiculous and crazy and contradictory things going on. So I hope that will drive some radical changes in the way that the devolved healthcare aspects of the UK work together going forward. It's not to say their health systems generally won't be different, but when it comes to major crises like this, one has to work together. Otherwise, you're going to be in real trouble next time.
Jonathan.
Well, Colin is, extraordinarily experienced on the subject of government, so I don't think I can tell him anything he doesn't know. I agree. I mean, I compared coronavirus earlier to a war, and something that often happens in wars is that you get a national government, a unity government. People come together, putting their politics to one side for the time being, and work together. The politics of the current environment have obviously not allowed that. They've not allowed that within England, and they've not allowed that across the United Kingdom, and they haven't allowed it across Europe either, have they? Richard was talking earlier about the importance in an international pandemic of countries collaborating. There hasn't been an enormous amount of sign of that, has there? And it obviously is dispiriting to see how the different political parties leading each of the countries of the United Kingdom have not, often found it easy to work together in a national crisis. But as I say, that's a subset of an international problem, which, speaking as not, someone who's not a politician, it's easy for me, I suppose, to say, couldn't they have done it better? But I guess, it's easy for someone who's not been a politician to say that. I completely agree with Colin. The governments are both big and small. That was the point I was trying to make. Not the government is getting bigger or smaller, but it depends. It's really big in education. It's not very big on railways, but it's getting more so. Absolutely, Colin. These are it's context specific. I couldn't agree with you more. And Ian, you're right. Of course, there could have been more consultation on a plan. I mean, the bigger point, Ian, and I guess this is the Ian that I used to work with, is it? Is that there wasn't really a plan, was there? That's the problem we've all been facing. There wasn't really a plan. And I think, as I understand it right, there was one in South Korea. Yes,
as I understand as well, there was a plan in South Korea because of SARS and MERS and their experience over recurring years. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Colin's just informed me that the participants could only see their own questions. I didn't know that. So I don't know if the rest of the panel could see their own questions. My apologies if they haven't come up for the rest of you, but we have recorded this. It will be available. It only remains for me to thank all the attendees, but most of all, a very big thank you to Richard and Jonathan. As ever, when I talk to either of you or listen to either of you, I learn a huge amount, and it's always a great professional joy to listen to real experts in their field. So thank you for making the time, and it's been very informative. And with that, hopefully you'll come and join us again for another discussion, or in conversation with Alexander, as we like to call them. So thank you very much.